My name is Sharon Flynn. I'm the Director for Community Relations for the La Granja project, the Rio Tinto La Granja project, which is located here in Peru. We have a copper concession that we've been exploring for the last 6 years in northern Peru. I can only speak for what I know about Peru and what I know about this project. But within the work that we've been doing, there's a number of challenges that we face that I think might be applicable to other people in Peru, in Latin America, or in other countries. First, to be clear, within Peru, the law requires that mining companies that own a subsoil concession or have rights to a subsoil concession negotiate surface access directly with the landowners. So that immediately moves from the legal framework to the social framework. And in order for companies to gain surface rights or land access, they need to put together a social solution with landowners around what it is those landowners are willing to accept in order to allow the company to do their activities. And there's a number of issues that need to be considered in this social solution. The first is, what type of land ownership is there? Is the land owned by individuals, or is the land owned communally? Second, what is the social organization of the landowners and the impacted communities, and how is that going to impact how the company needs to reach agreement with those landowners around land access? Generally, communal land implies that there's communal ownership, so the company needs to think through what type of processes does the company need to participate in order to reach that communal ownership? What type of information are communal owners going to be looking for from the company? And generally that negotiation is going to be not just around payments related to land access, but also other broader development projects that the community may want the company to be involved in. If the land is individually owned, certainly in some cases it may be that that's a simple transaction between the landowner and the company. But in our case, around the La Granja project, where we have individually owned land, we also have communities that have very strong social organizations. So we can't just go off and reach an agreement just with landowners without understanding what it is the broader community wants to see about how we're reaching that transaction. And in those types of situations, the issues of transparency are very important, because communities with strong social organizations are going to want to know that each of those individual landowners are being treated fairly, and that one landowner isn't necessarily getting any more money just because they happen to be a better negotiator. So you have to build a process that's transparent and fair, that tries to achieve equity, but also allows for some confidentiality as to what the private individual landowner may be receiving for that land access. The other point that needs to be thought about is what type of access is required, and for how long does the company need to have that access. And there's a couple of issues that need to be understood in order to understand how that should be addressed. The first is, what is the land currently being used for, and what's the impact of that access? Does the company need access to all of the land that one particular person or one particular community might have that's currently being used for agriculture? And does the community depend on that agriculture for subsistence and for their livelihoods? So the company has to think through what type of impacts they're going to cause in creating that land access, and that's going to be based on what the community or the landowner is currently using the land for. The second is that the company needs to think through the risk of its own activities and how they can protect the community or the landowner from the risk of those activities. So for example, in our case, we lease land from landowners. Why? Because we're unclear as to what the future of the project is. So we don't want to begin engaging in purchasing land when we aren't quite sure when purchasing land is going to create a significant impact in a small rural community that's based on subsistence agriculture. So for us right now, leasing is the best way to protect communities from the uncertainty that we face in developing our copper project forward. And all of those factors are going to be different depending on the project and depending on the social context. And then finally, the big issue to work out is, well, what's the value of that access? And what is a fair value? And from there, three things need to be thought about. What does the landowner think is fair value? What does the community think is fair value? And what does the company think is fair value? Certainly what we faced is that landowners and communities say, well, you should pay us a lot of money because it's mining land. And our response is, no, we don't know if it's mining land. We're in the midst of an exploration project, and we're trying to figure out whether or not this project could actually become a mine. So we need to think through, well, how do we compensate for expectations, but in a way that doesn't distort local land prices, and that actually is a value that makes sense to us in our operations and is an accepted value to the landowners and the communities. All of those are important issues to think through, whether or not you're trying to work through short-term land access or whether or not you're trying to work through long-term and land access. Moving into long-term land access, the issue of resettlement comes up. Resettlement, by resettlement I refer to the need to actually relocate communities and their livelihoods if they're dependent on land and if there is a big social risk to actually engaging in a simple real estate transaction with those landowners. And that's the challenge that a lot of mining projects in Peru face. In Peru, there's some particular challenges related to the scarcity of land. There's not a lot of arable land left in Peru that's not owned. Livelihood transitions. How do you, if you have to resettle people or people want to move far away and do different things, how do you support that livelihood transition? Expectations for employment on the future mine. How do you reach agreements around employability that doesn't strap the company into promising jobs in perpetuity to people who are the original landowners? And then finally, reestablishing social networks. I think there's a lot of alternatives to land acquisition transactions, and those alternatives, though, need to be considered given what's going on in the social context. Certainly in Canada, for example, where some of the First Nations actually have the legal right to negotiate access to the subsoil, and who have a very, very long-term relationship with the land, they would prefer to do long-term lease agreements. That may make sense in other types of communities around the world, but that really depends on how long the mine's going to be operating for, the relationship of those communities to that land. If you're talking about a mine that's going to operate for 70 to 100 years, and a community that's only been there for 50 years, then you have to sit down and work out with the community what type of access they want to have over the long term. And I think you also have to be careful not to confuse, not to get caught up in losing sight of value. It's easy, it might be easy to say, oh, well, we're leasing the land so that the communities can come back. It might be very easy to hide value in that type of transaction or delay value in that type of transaction, when really what needs to be thought about is what do communities need up front in order to ensure that they have a good livelihood transition, post-land acquisition, and that they have the resources necessary to be successful. So I think that what really is going to determine how land is acquired is companies really understanding all of these factors, how the communities are organized, what their relationship is to the land, what the current land is being used for, what the company wants to use the land for, and then what the legal framework is, and merging those to find the best integrated solution. First, I think communities should clearly understand the legal framework that applies to the resource activity, what type of agreements the company has with the government, what the government expects of the company, what the rights of the community are, what the obligations of the community and landowners are, if there are any. I think all of those are very important. And certainly in Peru, all of those issues have been in a lot of discussion lately, particularly around free, prior, informed consent. Second, though, I would say is really the government also needs to have participation and play a strong role in communities understanding the legal context, and government also playing a role in working to support the communities and the landowners and the company to reach an agreement that makes sense within the legal framework, but that also makes sense in the social framework and in the social context.